There is a word that holds everything a relationship can hold. Not a long word, one syllable in English, but a word that means you belong to someone and they belong to you. That you are not simply a person in a room, but specifically the person they come from. My name is Helen Carter. I am 81 years old. And there came a time when my children stopped using that word when they spoke to me. First in front of other people, then in private, then between themselves when they thought I wasn't listening. No announcement, no conversation, just a gradual, quiet erasure. And me trying not to notice how much each instance of it cost me. I had spent most of my life in a small town outside Manchester, in the house my husband George and I bought when the children were young. 3 children, David, who is 54, Paul, who is 50, and Karen, who is 46. I raised them while working part-time at the pharmacy on the high street, dispensing medications and knowing the regulars and keeping things in order. Not because I had to exactly, but because it gave me something that was mine outside the house, and because the extra money helped during the years when it was tight. George drove buses for the city and was gone long hours, and I learned to manage things. The school runs, the illnesses, the arguments between siblings, the money at the end of the month that never quite reached as far as we needed. I learned to be the person who kept things together. George died 11 years ago, quietly, at home, in the way of people who have lived without making much noise about themselves and who seem to leave the same way. Not suddenly, but not with prolonged difficulty either. Just a gradual lessening that became an absence one morning. I had looked after him through the last years, which had their own kind of work and their own kind of intimacy. And when he was gone, the house became a different kind of quiet. After he was gone, I held the family even more tightly, convinced, in the way you convince yourself of things when you're frightened, that if I stopped being useful to them, I would slowly disappear from their lives altogether. I had always believed that the love between a parent and a child remains something visible and mutually maintained, no matter how much time passes, how busy everyone gets, how many hundreds of miles separate them. I had believed that what you build over decades with someone cannot simply erode through inattention. I was wrong about that, or at least I was wrong about how little maintenance it sometimes receives when everyone assumes someone else is providing it. If you have ever held a family together for years, and then started to wonder, genuinely and uncomfortably, whether the holding was ever noticed, subscribe to this channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The changes came gradually, the way the most significant changes usually do. Small enough at first to seem like nothing, accumulating into something that couldn't be ignored. Karen started saying Helen instead of Mum in front of her colleagues or friends. The careful, formal tone of someone putting a little distance between herself and something she might find embarrassing. David and Paul followed, almost without noticing, the way people pick up conversational habits from the people around them. Family conversations began moving around me rather than through me. Decisions were made before I was consulted. If I told a story I had told before, someone would exchange a patient glance across the table with someone else. Not unkind exactly, just containing. When I gave advice, they smiled in that particular careful way people smile at someone they've quietly reclassified as fragile. Nobody was openly unkind. That was, precisely, what made it so hard to name and so hard to respond to. The distance arrived disguised as ordinary moments, as a tone of voice, as a glance exchanged across a table, as the particular quality of patience that isn't kindness but looks like it. The way cruelty doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Over time, I noticed that they called when they needed something. A babysitter on a Friday evening when their arrangements had fallen through. A signature on paperwork that involved my property or my savings, and that I signed without fully understanding because the explanation had been given quickly and I hadn't wanted to slow things down by asking for it again. A loan for something urgent and, when I pressed, slightly vague. They came with needs and left when the needs were met, and for a long time I was grateful for even that contact, which I recognised much later as precisely the problem. Being grateful for the crumbs of attention that come attached to requests. They spoke regularly about worrying over me living alone, and returned regularly to the idea of selling my house. Before it becomes too much to manage, they said, with a gentleness so consistent that I eventually understood the gentleness was not being deployed for my benefit. Behind it was something simpler. The house had become valuable, and having it occupied by me, who wasn't going anywhere, was an inconvenience dressed as a concern. I could feel myself becoming a practical problem to be solved, rather than a person they actually missed. But I couldn't locate the single moment when that had happened, which made it impossible to point to or contest. It had arrived the way erosion arrives, without ever doing anything you could call an act. Have you ever felt that you have become something to be managed rather than someone to be loved, and you cannot find the single moment to point to? Tell me honestly. The realization settled on a Sunday afternoon in a way I hadn't anticipated. My youngest grandson, Sam, he is 10 years old and asks things the way children ask things before they learn which questions make adults uncomfortable. Looked around the table and asked, directly, why everyone called me Helen instead of Grandma. The room went quiet for a beat too long. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of people who know the answer and don't have a version of it that sounds acceptable. Karen laughed, slightly too quickly, and changed the subject. Sam nodded and moved on, as children do when the adult world becomes momentarily impenetrable. But I sat at that table with my hands in my lap and felt something inside me, something I hadn't known was still holding, give way. Not loudly, not with any external sign, just with the quiet, precise collapse of something that has been under stress for a long time and finally reaches the thing it can't carry anymore. That evening I sat alone in the kitchen with the photo album, the old one with the thick cardboard pages and the cellophane overlays that I had bought to put pictures in when David was about 2 and that I had kept adding to for 25 years. I sat with it at the kitchen table for a long time. There were photographs of scraped knees I had cleaned and bandaged. I could remember specific ones, the circumstances of each small disaster. Birthday cakes baked after night shifts, still half asleep, because I had promised and promising meant keeping it. Christmas mornings when all 3 of them still climbed into my bed before it was fully light. In the years before Christmas became an event to coordinate, rather than a morning to inhabit. I looked at those photographs, and I looked at the woman in them, busy, necessary, wanted, called Mum, without anyone thinking about it, because it was simply what she was. I understood something sitting there that I had been actively avoiding understanding for several years. That I had spent a long time accepting progressively less because I was frightened of losing my place in the family altogether. And that somewhere along the way, quietly, without anyone deciding it, without any single moment I could point to, I had already lost the version of that place that mattered. Helen Carter had spent her adult life being competent at exactly the things that don't get noticed, which is to say, the things that only get noticed when they stop. The logistics of other people's crises, the management of feelings that weren't hers but became her responsibility to contain and smooth and redirect. The work of keeping a family in its shape, while everyone inside it lived as though the shape maintained itself. She had done all of this reliably and without complaint, because it was how she had always understood love, as a verb, as something you do with your hands and your time and your attention, as something you keep doing even when it isn't done back, because the not doing back is just what life looks like sometimes. She had not, until that night alone in the kitchen with the photo album, clearly understood that doing and being seen are two entirely different things, and that she had been confused for a very long time about which one was happening. She had been doing, she had not been seen, or rather, she had been seen as a function rather than as a person, which is a particular kind of not being seen that takes much longer to recognize because it comes wrapped in acknowledgement. When someone uses you, they acknowledge you. The acknowledgement obscures the using. Without announcing anything, without a conversation or a declaration, she changed. She stopped calling first, not as punishment, not as strategy, but because she had run out of the specific energy that initiating contact that is not returned in kind requires, which is a very particular kind of energy, and one she had been depleting for years without noticing. Sunday lunches quietly ended. She joined a gardening club that met on Thursday mornings at the community allotments. Women of various ages, some younger than her children, who talked about plants with knowledge and practicality, and who asked her opinion about things because she knew things and they wanted to know them. They asked and then waited for the answer, which was the specific quality of attention she had not received in some time. She began taking the train into Manchester once a week, to walk through the city in whatever direction she wanted, and look at things and sit in cafes, and be among people who didn't know her history or her name or anything about her except what they could see in a moment. She signed up for watercolour classes at the community centre on Wednesday afternoons, something she had wanted to do for at least 10 years, and had always postponed because there was something else that needed doing first, which there always was, which was part of how she had lived. For the first time in decades, parts of her days belonged entirely to herself, to no one's schedule, no one's crisis, no one's need for her to be available. Just to her, in the way mornings belong to whoever is awake in them before anyone else has made a claim. Her children reacted with confusion and something that, in her oldest son, looked very much like irritation. David told her, more than once, and in different framings, that she was becoming distant, using the word the way people use it when they mean that something they depended on has become less available. Karen asked, with the careful phrasing of someone who doesn't want to be held responsible for the implication they're making, whether someone had put ideas in her head. Helen answered simply, without anger in her voice, because anger was not what she felt, that she was tired of making herself smaller so that everyone else could feel comfortable, that she had been doing it for a long time, and it had not, as far as she could tell, worked. This unsettled them more than any anger would have, and she understood why it would. They were accustomed to a mother who absorbed neglect silently and remained endlessly available regardless of what they provided in return. The version of her they had been operating with had certain reliable properties, and those properties had changed. Now they had to notice the absence of something they had stopped actively valuing, which is a different, more uncomfortable kind of noticing than being confronted with something you know you've done wrong. A few months later, a brief episode of faintness while shopping in the high street landed her in hospital overnight for observation. Nothing serious, blood pressure, a period of rest required, the ordinary monitoring that becomes more frequent when a body has been running for 8 decades. But her children arrived frightened, all 3 of them, in the way people arrive when they have been reminded of something they had stopped thinking about. They talked over each other with the compressed, slightly desperate energy of people trying to repair what they haven't acknowledged needing to repair. Helen listened to them for a while. Then she said, quietly, without reproach in her voice, because reproach was not what she was looking for and wouldn't have been honest anyway, that growing old was not the hardest part of her life. She had managed the physical parts. She had expected them. The hardest part was something she hadn't expected. Hearing her own children stop calling her mum, as though the word had slowly become unnecessary or embarrassing or simply too old-fashioned a way of addressing someone whose primary function had shifted from mother to practical arrangement. Nobody offered a defence, and she hadn't expected one. Karen cried. Not with drama, but with the particular quality of tears that come when someone names something you had been carefully not naming for a long time, and the naming removes the option of continuing not to name it. David sat with his hands on his knees, looking at the floor, unable to look at her. Paul, who was usually the one with something to say about everything, said nothing at all. Sometimes silence is the most honest response available. When she came home, nothing was immediately perfect. These things don't repair quickly, and she hadn't expected them to. The gradual erosion of years doesn't reverse in a week. But something had shifted in a way she could feel, even if she couldn't describe it precisely. Her children came without needing something from her. They stayed for the length of a visit rather than the length of an errand. They listened when she spoke, actually listened, with the quality of attention that lets someone finish their sentence before deciding what to say next. They asked how she was and remained in the question long enough for the answer to be real. It was different from what had been before, and she noticed the difference the way you notice the return of something you had stopped expecting. One cold morning, February, still dark by the time she got up, frost on the outside of the kitchen window, the phone rang just after sunrise. Helen answered without hurrying, and heard Karen's voice on the other end. Quieter than usual. Slightly uncertain, in the way of someone who knows they are making a choice and is not entirely sure of their footing. "Mum, are you awake? I was wondering if I could come and see you today." Helen stood in the kitchen holding the phone. She closed her eyes for a moment. Not Mum, followed by a question about childcare or a document or a concern she needed managing. Not Mum as the first word of a sentence that ended with a request. Just Mum, asked carefully, with the slight hesitation of someone who had thought before speaking, and a question that was only and simply about whether she wanted company today. She said yes. She said she would put the kettle on. She put the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the early morning quiet, and then she filled the kettle. Tell me, when the people you raised stopped using the word that connected you to them and to yourself, slowly, without noticing, through the accumulated small decisions of daily life, how did you find your way back to who you had always been? And how did you know it was time to start?